The wind did not blow in Blackwood so much as it scoured. It came down off the jagged spine of the southern mountains, stripped of moisture and carrying the gritty taste of alkaline dust, hunting for any crack in the clapboard to whistle through. It was the year 1885, and the drought had been sitting on the territory for 3 years like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The town itself looked as if it had been sun-bleached. The timber of the boardwalks was warped and gray, pulling up the nails that tried to hold it down. The water troughs were scummed over with green slime or standing bone dry, and the few horses tied at the hitching rails stood with their heads low, tails flicking lethargically at the flies that seemed to be the only things thriving in the heat. It was late afternoon when Jonah Carver rode onto the main street. The sun was dipping toward the western peaks, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the dirt like grasping fingers. Jonah sat his saddle with the heavy, unthinking posture of a man who had spent more of his life on leather than on a chair. He was 48 years old, though the sun and the wind had carved deep lines into his face that made him look a decade older. There was gray at his temples, silver threads woven through the dark, unkempt hair that hung beneath the brim of his stained hat. He rode a bay gelding that had seen better days, its ribs showing faintly through a coat matted with trail dust. Jonah looked no better. His duster was tattered at the hem, coated in the pale earth of the badlands he had crossed, and the pistol at his hip sat in a holster that had been oiled and worn smooth by years of friction. The town watched him come. In places like Blackwood, strangers were treated with a suspicion that bordered on hostility. 2 men sitting on a bench outside the general store stopped their whittling to stare. A woman sweeping her porch paused, leaning on her broom, her eyes narrowing as she took in the weary set of his shoulders and the way his hand rested near, but not on, his gun. They saw a drifter. They saw a man who had outlived his usefulness. In the West, a man was worth what his back could carry or what his money could buy, and Jonah Carver looked like he had neither strength left to give nor a coin to his name. Jonah ignored them. He had been ignored or despised in 100 towns just like this one. He felt the ache in his knees, a sharp, grinding pain that never really went away anymore, and the stiffness in his lower back that would take half the night to loosen. He was thirsty, a deep, parched craving that made his tongue feel like a piece of dry felt in his mouth. But he did not stop at the saloon. He needed to see to the horse first. He guided the bay toward the far end of the street, where a weathered sign creaked on rusted hinges, Hayes Livery Feed. Inside the livery, the air was cooler but thick with the smell of dry hay and horse sweat. Clara Hayes was lifting a saddle onto a rack, gritting her teeth against the weight. She was 25, a woman with sharp features and eyes the color of dark coffee, eyes that had seen too much grief for a face so young. She wore a man's work shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were tanned and strong, and a heavy canvas skirt that was stained with grease and dirt. She shoved the saddle into place and wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. The livery was quiet, too quiet. Most of the stalls were empty. The drought had forced the smaller ranchers to sell off their stock or drive them north, and with fewer horses came less need for boarding and less money for feed. She walked to the small office at the front of the barn and opened the ledger on the desk. The numbers were grim. Red ink dominated the pages. She stared at the figures, willing them to change. But the math was as unforgiving as the land outside. The sound of boots on the gravel outside made her look up. She stiffened, her hand instinctively moving to the small knife she kept in her pocket. It was not a customer. She knew the heavy, arrogant tread. A shadow fell across the doorway, blocking the dying sunlight. It was Ed Cobb, one of Silas Boone's foremen. He was a thick-necked man with a mustache that hid a cruel mouth, and he wore his gun low, like a gunfighter, though everyone knew he was mostly just a bully on a payroll. "Afternoon, Miss Hayes," Cobb said, leaning against the door frame. He picked at his teeth with a splinter of wood. Clara did not smile. "What do you want?" "Cobb, just coming to check on things. Mr. Boone wanted me to remind you that the 1st of the month is coming up. He is a patient man. But the bank, well, the bank has rules. Tell Mr. Boone, I know the date, Clara said, her voice steady despite the flutter of fear in her chest. I will have the payment. Cobb laughed. A dry, rasping sound. Will you? I looked at your feed supply out back. You are running low on grain. You got 3 horses boarding here, and 2 of them belong to old man Miller, who has not paid a bill in 6 months. Mr. Boone is just trying to help you. Clara, his offer still stands. He will buy the land, pay off your father's debts, and you can walk away with a little something in your pocket. Maybe find a husband. A pretty thing like you should not be shoveling manure. My father's debts are my business, Clara snapped, slamming the ledger shut. And this land is not for sale. Not to Silas Boone. Not to anyone. Cobb's smile vanished. He stepped into the office, the small space suddenly feeling crowded and dangerous. You are being foolish. Your daddy is dead. Clara, he is not coming back to save you. And a woman alone out here. Bad things happen. Get out, Clara said, pointing to the door. Cobb did not move. He reached out, his hands shooting forward to grab her upper arm. His grip was bruising. You need to listen when your betters are talking to you. Girl, Clara cried out, not in fear, but in anger, trying to wrench her arm away. But Cobb held fast, twisting her skin. Let go of me. I'm just trying to teach you some manners. Cobb sneered. Let her go. The voice was low, rasping like gravel sliding down a chute. It did not shout. It did not carry the high pitch of adrenaline. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered from the entrance of the barn. Cobb froze. He turned his head, keeping his grip on Clara's arm. Jonah Carver stood in the wide double doors of the livery. He was silhouetted against the blinding white light of the street, a dark, ragged shape. He had not drawn his gun. His hands hung loose at his sides, his thumbs hooked near his belt buckle. Who are you? Cobb demanded, though he loosened his grip slightly. Just a man looking to water a horse, Jonah said. He stepped inside. The transition from light to shadow, revealing the scars on his face and the cold, flat look in his gray eyes. I said let her go. Cobb sized him up. He saw the gray hair, the dust, the worn boots. He saw a man who looked like he could be pushed over with a strong wind. You stay out of this, old man. This is private business. Move along before you get hurt. Jonah did not blink. He took another step forward. The sound of his spurs on the hard-packed dirt floor was the only noise in the barn. I'm not going to ask you twice, Jonah said. There was something in his voice, a weary certainty that unsettled Cobb. It was not the bluster of a young man trying to prove himself. It was the quiet assurance of a man who had seen violence, who had dealt it out, and who was not afraid of it. Cobb looked at Jonah's hands. They were steady. He looked at Jonah's eyes. They were dead calm. Cobb released Clara, shoving her back slightly against the desk. He held up his hands, forcing a mocking grin. All right, no need to get excited. Grandpa, I was just leaving anyway. He brushed past Jonah, deliberately bumping his shoulder against the older man. Jonah did not budge. He stood like a rooted oak. Cobb paused at the door, glancing back at Clara. Think about the offer. Clara, Mr. Boone does not like to be kept waiting. Then he was gone, his boots crunching away toward the saloon. Clara rubbed her arm where Cobb's fingers had left red marks. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a mix of fear and humiliation. She hated that she had been afraid. She hated that she had been handled. And most of all, she hated that a stranger had seen it. She straightened her spine and looked at the man standing in the center of her barn. He looked tired. He looked like something the cat had dragged in and refused to eat. I did not ask for your help, she said, her voice sharp. Jonah took off his hat, slapping the dust from it against his leg. A cloud of grit drifted into the air. I know you did not. I could have handled him. Looked like he had a firm grip, Jonah said, his tone neutral. Clara flushed. I do not need rescuing, especially not by drifters looking for a handout. Jonah watched her. He saw the tremble in her hands that she was trying to hide. He saw the pride in the set of her jaw. He admired it, even as it annoyed him. "I am not looking for a handout. I am looking to board my horse, and a place to sleep out of the wind." Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. "You got money to pay for that?" Jonah reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. It was not much. Enough for maybe 2 days of grain and a meal. He looked at the money, then at Clara. "I have got a little, but I am willing to work for the rest. I saw a section of your corral fence that is leaning. Roof looks like it has lost some shingles too. I can fix tack. I can gentle horses if you have got any that need schooling." Clara crossed her arms. "I cannot afford to hire help. The whole town knows that." "I am not asking for wages," Jonah said. "Just feed for the bay, and a corner of the loft for me. I will not be in your way." Clara studied him. She knew what the town would say. They were already whispering that she was destitute, if she took in a drifter. A man old enough to be her father, but with the look of a killer. The tongues would never stop wagging. Silas Boone would use it against her. But she looked at the fence line Jonah had mentioned. It was leaning. She could not fix it herself. The posts were too heavy, and there was a storm coming. She could smell it in the air. "You sleep in the loft," Clara said, her voice hard. "You do not smoke up there. You do not drink up there. And if I catch you stealing so much as a bridle buckle, I will shoot you myself." Jonah nodded once. "Fair enough. My name is Clara Hayes. Jonah Carver." He led his horse to the water trough. Clara watched him. She saw the way he checked the animal's hooves, the gentle way he rubbed the gelding's ears. He was careful. That was rare. Most men around here were rough with their animals, treating them like machines until they broke. Jonah watered the horse, then found a stall. He worked with an efficiency that spoke of decades on the trail. Clara went back to her office, but she could not focus on the ledger. She kept glancing through the dirty window at the man working in her barn. The gossip started before the sun had even fully set. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, had seen Jonah ride in. She had seen him go into the livery. She told the baker, who told the blacksmith. "He looks dangerous, Mrs." Gable said, clutching her shawl tighter, like a wolf that has lost its pack, and old, too old to be of any use to anyone decent. "Why would Clara let him stay?" the baker asked. "Desperation," the blacksmith grunted. "She is drowning in debt. She would hire the devil himself if he could swing a hammer. It is not proper, Mrs." Gable sniffed. "A young woman alone with a man like that? It is scandalous." The sun finally vanished behind the mountains, and the sky turned a bruised purple. The wind, which had been constant all day, suddenly picked up, howling with a new ferocity. It was a dust storm, one of the bad ones. Inside the livery, the lanterns swung on their hooks, casting jumping shadows on the walls. "Storm is coming," Jonah said. He had finished grooming his horse and was standing by the main doors, watching the wall of brown dirt advancing down the street. "We need to close the shutters," Clara said, grabbing a long pole. They worked together. Jonah was taller, able to reach the high latches that Clara usually had to drag a crate over to reach. They moved in a rhythm, securing the heavy wooden doors, barring them against the wind. The sound outside became a roar, like a freight train passing inches from the building. Sand and grit peppered the walls like buckshot. When the last latch was thrown, the silence inside the barn was sudden and heavy. The air was still, filled with the golden glow of the oil lamps. Jonah rubbed his shoulder, grimacing slightly. "Hurt?" Clara asked. She had not meant to ask, but the words slipped out. "Old bullet," Jonah said. "Damp weather or bad storms make it sing." Clara leaned against a stall door, exhaustion finally overtaking her adrenaline. She looked at him, really looked at him. Up close, the scars were more visible. There was a jagged white line running from his jaw down his neck, another on the back of his hand. "You have done a lot of fighting." "Mr. Carver." Jonah took a seat on a crate, resting his elbows on his knees. "More than I wanted. Where are you from?" Jonah looked at the floor. "Texas, originally. but I have not been there in 20 years. Rode for the Red River outfit down near the border for a long time. Clara's eyes widened slightly. The Red River outfit, even here, 300 miles north. She had heard stories. They were hard men, mercenaries, mostly, who worked for the highest bidder during the range wars. That is a rough crowd. She said. Jonah nodded slowly. I left. Why? Jonah looked up, meeting her gaze. His eyes were dark pools of regret. Things went bad. A man has to know when to walk away. Miss Hayes, sometimes you look at your hands and you do not recognize them anymore. You realize you have been digging graves for so long you forgot how to build anything else. Clara fell silent. She understood the concept of loss, of ghosts. My father built this place, she said softly. He came out here 10 years ago. Thought this town was going to be the next Denver. He worked himself into the ground. When he died last winter, everyone told me to sell. They said a woman cannot run a livery. They said I should go back east, find some cousins I have never met. But you stayed, Jonah said. I stayed. This is all I have. If I leave, I disappear. I become just another name in a family Bible somewhere. Here, I am Clara Hayes. This is my dirt. Jonah looked at her with a strange expression. It was respect. She realized. It is a hard thing, he said, holding on to something when the whole world wants to take it from you. The wind howled outside, rattling the boards. For a moment, in the flickering light, the distance between them, the 20 years of age, the different lives, the stranger and the local, seemed to vanish. They were just two people sheltering from the storm. You better get up to the loft, Clara said, breaking the moment. She straightened up, pulling her defenses back into place. Morning comes early. Jonah nodded. He stood up, the joints popping audibly. Good night, Miss Hayes. Clara. Jonah paused. Good night. Clara. He climbed the ladder to the loft. Clara blew out the lantern in the office and checked the doors one last time. The storm was raging, screaming against the wood. She walked to the back of the barn to check the rear door. There was a gap in the wood there, a knot that had fallen out. Through the roar of the wind, she could hear voices. The back of the livery abutted the alley behind the Golden Nugget Saloon. Men were shouting over the wind, laughing. Did you see him? One voice yelled. Looked like a stiff wind would blow him over. Clara pressed her ear to the wood. Clara is desperate, another voice laughed. She is desperate enough to hire old gun leather. What is she thinking? Bringing a stray dog like that in? She needs a man. That is what it is, and I guess she is not picky about the vintage. Laughter erupted, coarse and ugly. Maybe I should go pay her a visit, the first voice said. If she is taking in charity cases, maybe she wants some company that can actually do something. Clara pulled back from the wall, as if burned. The words stung worse than the sand outside. Old gun leather. Desperate. She looked up at the dark opening of the loft where Jonah was sleeping. She thought of his gray hair, his tired eyes, the way he had stood up to Cobb without flinching. She felt a heavy weight settle in her stomach. By letting him stay, by accepting his help, she had crossed a line. The town had judged him as useless wreckage, and by extension, they were judging her for scouring the scrap heap. She was alone, truly alone, and the only person who had offered to stand beside her was a man the world had already thrown away. Clara walked back to her small room attached to the office. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, listening to the wind trying to tear the roof off. She wrapped her arms around herself. Up in the loft, Jonah lay on his bedroll, listening to the same wind. He stared up at the darkness of the rafters. He had heard the voices, too. He knew what they were saying. He knew he should saddle the bay and ride out before dawn. It would be better for her, but he remembered the fear in her eyes when Cobb had grabbed her, and he remembered the steel in her voice when she said, "This is my dirt." He rolled over, wincing as his hip dug into the hard floor. He was too old for this. He knew it. The town knew it. But as he closed his eyes, He saw the face of the man who had grabbed her, and Jonah Carver's hands, scarred and tired as they were, curled into fists in the dark. He wasn't dead yet, and he still owed for the night's shelter. The weeks that followed the great dust storm did not bring relief. They brought a heat so heavy and physical, it felt like a yoke across the shoulders of every man and beast in the territory. The sun rose white and hot, bleaching the color out of the sky by mid-morning, and it set in a bloody haze that promised no respite for the coming day. Jonah Carver became a fixture at the Hayes livery. Though he remained a ghost to the rest of the town, he worked with a rhythm that was deceptive to the casual observer. He moved slowly, his boots dragging slightly in the dust, his movements lacking the snap and vigor of a younger man. But Clara noticed that he never stopped. He was like the water wheel at the creek used to be before the stream ran dry, a constant, grinding force. He fixed the corral fence, replacing the rotted posts with timber he salvaged and shaped with a draw knife until the wood was smooth as bone. He repaired the roof, spending hours baking on the shingles, his shirt dark with sweat, hammering with a steady, rhythmic thud that became the heartbeat of the yard. Most of all, he handled the horses. There was a sorrel mare that old man Miller had left, a skittish thing that rolled her eyes and kicked at the slats whenever anyone came near. Clara had given up on grooming her, resigning herself to just tossing hay over the stall door. Jonah went into the stall on his third day. Clara had shouted a warning, expecting the sound of splintering wood and a crushed rib. Instead, she heard a low, rumbling hum. Jonah stood by the mare's shoulder, one hand resting lightly on her withers, humming a tune that had no words, just a vibration that seemed to seep into the animal's panic and quiet it. By the end of the week, the mare was eating out of his hand. It was brutal work. The drought meant the town well was low, and water had to be hauled from the deeper aquifer pump at the edge of town for the stock. Twice a day, Jonah and Clara hitched the wagon and drove the half-mile, filling heavy oak barrels bucket by bucket. They worked side by side in the blinding glare, their skin turning the color of saddle leather, their lips chapped and cracking. They spoke little during these tasks. The heat made conversation a waste of breath. But there was a language in the work itself. Clara would struggle with a full bucket, her arms shaking, and a moment later Jonah's calloused hand would be there to take the weight, not with a comment on her weakness, but with a simple nod. She learned to trust his presence. He was there when he said he would be. In a world where men left, her father to death, the ranch hands to better-paying jobs up north, Jonah's stubborn reliability was a strange, new anchor. But the work could not stop the ledger from bleeding red. The price of hay had tripled as the grass on the range turned to tinder. Smaller ranches were folding, families packing up their wagons and drifting west toward California or back east to civilization, leaving unpaid bills in their wake. Silas Boone did not leave. He grew, like a buzzard that fattens when the herd starves. Boone's shadow lengthened over the valley. He came to the livery on a Tuesday, riding a massive black stallion that looked too well fed for the country it stood on. He was flanked by 3 men, including Ed Cobb. Boone was a handsome man in a cold, statuesque way, with silver hair carefully pomaded and a suit that cost more than Clara's entire business. "Miss Hayes," Boone said, remaining on his horse so he could look down at her. "You are looking tired. The heat is not kind to a woman's complexion." Clara stood by the office door, wiping her hands on a rag. "I am busy. Mr. Boone, if you have business, state it. Always so sharp." Boone smiled, but the smile did not touch his eyes. They were pale blue, the color of winter ice. "I'm just making my rounds, checking on my neighbors. I saw the bank manager this morning. He tells me you are 2 months behind on the mortgage payments for the land. The bank and I have an understanding," Clara said, though her stomach twisted. "Banks do not have understandings. Miss Hayes." "They have foreclosure notices." Boone leaned forward, resting his gloved hands on the saddle horn. "My offer remains on the table. It is a generous one, more than fair, considering the state of things. I will pay off the lien, give you $500 for the deed. And you can take a stagecoach to a city where a lady does not have to shovel manure. Clara felt the heat of the day and the heat of her anger mixing in her blood. And what happens to the livery? I need the land for grazing access to the creek. Boone shrugged. The buildings are of no use to me. I would burn them down. Clara gripped the doorframe. This business was my father's life, and now it is his tombstone. Boone said softly, "Do not be sentimental. Clara, it is a luxury the poor cannot afford." From the shadows of the barn interior, Jonah watched. He was cleaning a bridle, a piece of oil-soaked rag in his hand. He did not step out. He stayed in the dark, where he could see without being the center of attention. He watched Boone's hands, soft, manicured, but strong. He watched the men behind Boone. They sat their horses with a loose, heavy relaxation that Jonah recognized. It was the posture of men who were not worried about being shot at because they were usually the ones doing the shooting. Jonah knew men like Boone. He had worked for them. He had killed for them. They were not driven by anger or passion. They were driven by an appetite that could never be filled. Boone did not just want the land. He wanted the submission of everyone on it. He wanted to be the god of this little dusted-over patch of hell. Boone's eyes flicked to the barn door, trying to penetrate the gloom. "Is that the stray dog I hear you took in?" Clara stepped forward, blocking his view. "Mr. Carver works for me, and he is none of your concern." Boone laughed, a rich, baritone sound. "Careful, Clara. Old dogs sometimes bite the hand that feeds them, or they bring fleas. You are damaging your reputation harboring a drifter." "People talk. Let them talk," Clara said. "Good day, Mr. Boone." Boone straightened, gathering his reins. "Soon. Clara, the bank will not wait forever, and neither will I. Accidents happen when people get desperate." He turned his horse and rode off, his men trailing him like a pack of wolves. Clara watched them go until the dust settled. She felt a trembling in her legs and sat heavily on the bench by the door. She put her head in her hands. She was 25 years old, and she felt 100. Jonah stepped out of the barn. He did not say anything comforting. He did not tell her it would be all right. He just walked to the water bucket, dipped a ladle, and handed it to her. "He is a bad man," Jonah said quietly. "I know." Clara took the water, her hand shaking slightly. "But he is a rich man. Around here, that is the same thing as being a lawman or a saint." Jonah looked at the horizon where Boone had vanished. "No, it is not. Money just buys you a better shovel to bury the bodies." 2 nights later, a wagon limped into town. It was a pitiful sight. The canvas cover torn and flapping in the evening breeze, the wheels wobbling on dry axles. A man and a woman sat on the bench, hollow-eyed and gaunt, and 3 children peered out from the back, their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes huge and hopeless. They stopped in front of the general store, but the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, came out with a broom and waved them off. "No handouts," Henderson shouted. "I got my own mouths to feed. Keep moving." The man on the wagon slumped. "We have got coin," he rasped, though he looked like he was lying. "Just need a little flour, maybe some grain for the mules." "Show me the coin," Henderson demanded. The man hesitated, and that was answer enough. The few townsfolk on the street stopped to watch, snickering. It was easier to laugh at the misfortune of others than to admit they were all teetering on the same edge. "Go on, get!" Henderson shouted. "Drifters bring disease. We do not want your kind here." Clara was closing up the livery when the wagon rolled past, the mules' heads dragging in the dirt. The man looked at Clara, then looked away, too ashamed to ask again. "Wait," Clara called out. She walked out into the street. Her heart was pounding. She knew the ledger. She knew she was 2 months behind on the mortgage. She knew every grain of oats in the bin was counted. "Pull them in here," she said, pointing to the livery yard. The man looked at her with disbelief. We cannot pay much. Miss, I did not ask you to pay," Clara said, her voice loud enough for Henderson to hear down the street. "I have got some spillover grain the mules can have, and there is water in the trough." Jonah was standing by the corral. He watched Clara guide the wagon in. He saw the set of her jaw, the defiant tilt of her chin. He knew what she was doing. She was spitting in the eye of the town, and she was cutting her own throat to do it, while Clara helped the man unhitch the mules and get them to water. Jonah walked to the back of the wagon. The 3 children watched him with terrified awe. He looked like a nightmare to them, tall, scarred, armed. Jonah reached into the pocket of his duster. He pulled out a strip of dried beef jerky. It was his ration for the next 2 days. He broke it into 3 pieces. "Here," he said, his voice rough. "Chew it slow. Make it last." The children snatched the meat with claw-like hands, stuffing it into their mouths. Jonah watched them for a second, his face unreadable, then turned away before anyone could see. Later that night, after the family had bedded down in the straw of the empty stalls, Clara sat in the office, staring at the wall. Jonah came in to hang up the keys. "You gave them half a sack of oats." Jonah said, "They were starving." "Jonah, those mules are half dead," he said. "Oats will not save them, and that sack cost you $2 you do not have. I could not just watch them move on," Clara snapped. "Did you see the children?" "I saw them," Jonah said. "I gave them food too. But I am just a hired hand. I do not have a mortgage hanging over my head. You are running a business. Clara, not a charity ward. You cannot save everyone who rolls down that road." Clara stood up, slamming her hand on the desk. "So I should be like Henderson. I should just sweep them away like trash. Is that it?" "I am saying you have to survive first," Jonah said calmly. "If Boone takes this place, you cannot help anyone. Kindness is a luxury." "I am not a drifter," Clara said, her voice rising. "I am not just passing through, taking what I can and moving on. I live here. This means something. Being human means something." Jonah went still. The word drifter hung in the air between them. "Is that what you think I do?" he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "You think I take what I can and leave. You are here, are you not?" Clara challenged him, though she immediately regretted the sting in her words. "You left Texas. You left the border. You run when it gets hard. I did not run because it got hard," Jonah said. The words came out like stones being ground together. "I ran because there was nothing left to stay for." He walked to the window, looking out at the black shape of the mountains. "I had a place," he said, "a small spread, west of the Pecos. It was not much, 40 acres of scrub and a cabin I built with these hands. I had a wife, Ellen." Clara went silent. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a sudden chill. "You never mentioned a wife." Jonah did not turn around. She did not like the life. She hated the guns. She wanted me to quit the outfit. I told her just one more drive. Just one more paycheck so we could buy seed cattle. He paused, and the silence stretched tight. "The outfit I rode for. We got into a dispute with some nesters over water rights. My boss, he did not like to share. He sent us to clear them out. It turned into a shooting war. One night, the nesters rode on my place, thinking I was home. I was not. Ellen was." Jonah's hand gripped the window frame until the knuckles turned white. "She got caught in the crossfire when I rode back in. By the time the smoke cleared, the cabin was burning. She was gone." He turned to face Clara. In the dim lamplight, he looked ancient. His eyes were open wounds. "I did not leave because I was a drifter. Clara, I left because every time I looked at that land, I saw her blood in the dirt. I left because if I stayed, I was going to kill every man within 100 miles. So do not tell me about building something. I know what it costs, and I know how fast it burns." Clara stood frozen. She felt the weight of his grief, a physical pressure in the room. It made her own troubles seem small, and yet it connected them. "I am sorry," she whispered. Jonah shook his head. "Sorry does not fix it." Clara stepped closer to him. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice trembling. "My father, he did not just die of fever. He gave up. The winter was hard, and the bank was calling every day. He stopped eating. He stopped getting out of bed. He just lay there and stared at the ceiling until his heart stopped." She looked up at Jonah. "The day of the funeral, the mayor and the banker came to the graveside. They shook my hand. They told me how sorry they were. And before the dirt was even covering his box, the banker asked me if I had the keys to the safe. They were like vultures, Jonah, circling, waiting for the meat to get cold." She looked at him, her dark eyes fierce and wet. "That is why I cannot turn people away, because I know what it feels like to be circled." Jonah looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the steel spine beneath the soft skin. He saw a woman who was fighting a war she was destined to lose, and fighting it anyway. "You are a stubborn woman." "Clara Hayes," he said softly. "And you are a cynical old man." "Jonah Carver," she replied, but there was no bite in it anymore. The summer deepened. The heat became a physical presence, a third person in the livery. They worked in a rhythm that had become comfortable, almost intimate in its silent coordination. Clara started watching him. She couldn't help it. She watched him when he was shirtless by the water trough, washing the grime of the day from his chest and arms. His body was a map of violence, scars from barbed wire, from knives, from bullets. But he was not frail. The muscles under his skin were ropey and hard, conditioned by a lifetime of labor. But it was his hands that drew her gaze. They were large, the knuckles swollen and battered, the skin rough as bark. Yet, when he worked on a horse's hoof or fixed a delicate leather strap, they moved with a surprising, fluid grace. They were capable hands, dangerous hands. Yes, but also protective. One afternoon, she was struggling to unbuckle a cinch that had stiffened with sweat and salt. Her fingers were sore, and she let out a frustration huff. "Here," Jonah said. He stepped in close. He did not push her aside. He just reached over. For a moment, his chest brushed against her shoulder. She could smell him, dust, horse, tobacco, and the sharp, salty scent of male sweat. It was not unpleasant. It was earthy and real. She watched his fingers work the buckle. He popped it loose in a second. "Thank you," she murmured. She looked up and found his face inches from hers. He was looking down at the saddle, but then his eyes flicked to hers. For a heartbeat, the air in the stable went thin. Clara felt a pull, a strange, terrifying gravity in the center of her chest. She wanted to lean into him. She wanted to rest her head against that scarred chest and let him hold up the world for a minute. The thought panicked her. He was old. He was a drifter. He was everything she was not supposed to want. "I can handle the rest," she said, her voice coming out too loud, too harsh. "You should go check the water level in the tank." Jonah stepped back immediately, his face closing up like a shuttered window. "Yes, ma'am." He walked away, and Clara stood there, her heart hammering, angry at herself and angry at the heat that was confusing her mind. Sunday brought the church social. It was the one time of the month when the town tried to pretend it was a civilized place. Lanterns were strung between the trees in the churchyard. A fiddle player sawed out tunes, and tables were laden with whatever cakes and pies the women could manage with the limited flour supply. Clara wore her only good dress, a pale blue calico that had been her mother's. She pinned her hair up, trying to hide the sunburn on her neck. She insisted Jonah come. "I need help carrying the pies," she had said, an excuse they both saw through. Jonah wore a clean shirt he had bought from the mercantile. Stiff and uncomfortable, he had shaved, revealing the sharp line of his jaw, though the gray stubble was already fighting to return. They arrived at the churchyard as the sun was setting. The air was slightly cooler, filled with the sound of laughter and fiddle music. But the moment they stepped into the light, the atmosphere changed. Conversation lulled. Eyes turned. Clara felt the judgment hit her like a physical wave. She was walking with the hired hand, the drifter. Reverend Gable walked over. A forced smile plastered on his face. "Miss Hayes, so good to see you." "Reverend," Clara said. "You know, Mr. Carver." The Reverend glanced at Jonah as if he were a fence post. "I see you brought your employee. There is plenty of punch by the gate. For the workers." Jonah's face didn't change. "I will wait by the wagon." "Clara, no," Clara said, her hand tightening on his arm. "You are my guest." Before she could say more, "Mrs." Gable bustled up, flanked by two other matrons. "Clara, dear, you look lovely. A bit thin, perhaps, but lovely. You must come say hello to Walter Prine. He has been asking about you all evening." Walter Prine was the bank manager's nephew, a young man with soft hands and a suit that fit too perfectly. He was allied with Boone, everyone knew that, but he was considered the catch of the town, Mrs. Gable steered Clara away, physically blocking Jonah from following. As they walked, Clara heard one of the women whisper loudly, "It is a shame. Really, dragging that old horse around. Someone ought to tell her that you shoot crippled animals. You do not parade them." Clara stiffened, but she was surrounded. Walter Prine was there, smiling, holding out a cup of punch. "Clara," he said smoothly, "you are the flower of the desert tonight." Clara took the punch, feeling trapped. She looked over Walter's shoulder, searching the edge of the light. Jonah was standing by the trees, in the shadows. He had taken out his tobacco pouch and was rolling a cigarette. He looked at the party, the dancing couples, the laughing children, the respectable men in their suits. He looked at Clara standing next to Walter. Walter was young. He was clean. He had a future. He could offer her safety. He could save the livery without a gun. Jonah struck a match on his boot heel. The flare illuminated his face for a second. The lines, the weariness, the scars. He blew out the smoke in the match, disappearing back into the dark. Clara saw him fade away. She saw Walter smiling at her, asking for a dance. "May I?" Walter asked, offering his arm. Clara took it. She had to. To refuse would be a scene she couldn't afford. As she stepped onto the packed earth of the dance floor, Walter's hand on her waist felt light and clammy. She spun in the circle, the music bright and hollow. She looked toward the trees again. Jonah was gone. A sharp pain spiked in her chest. It wasn't just worry, it was a jagged, hot flash of jealousy. He had withdrawn. He had looked at her in the light, surrounded by youth and propriety. And he had decided he didn't belong. He had stepped back to let the proper order of things take over. She hated him for it. She hated him for being right, and she hated him for leaving her alone in the crowd of people who smiled with their teeth but watched her like hawks. She danced with Walter, but her mind was out in the dark, with the smell of tobacco and the man who knew what it meant to lose everything. The air in the valley had turned heavy, pressing down on the town of Blackwood like a wet wool blanket. The sky was a bruised purple in the west, and the wind had died, leaving a silence that felt more like a held breath than peace. It was the kind of weather that made dogs snap at their masters and old men rub their aching joints, knowing that something violent was building on the horizon. Clara Hayes stood in the center of her office, her hands gripping the back of her father's chair until her knuckles turned white. The small room felt suffocatingly small. It was occupied by 3 men who took up too much space and sucked the oxygen out of the air. Silas Boone sat on the corner of her desk, a violation of her space that made Clara's skin crawl. He was swinging one polished boot casually, looking at a speck of dust on his lapel. Beside him stood Walter Prine, the banker's nephew, and the man the town had decided was Clara's salvation. Walter looked pale, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit. Behind them, leaning against the door to block any escape, was Ed Cobb. "I am trying to be reasonable." "Clara," Boone said, his voice smooth as oil, "I am trying to offer you a lifeline. Most women in your position would be on their knees thanking me." Clara kept her chin high, though her legs felt like water. "My position is that I own this livery and the land it sits on, and my answer is the same as it was last week." "No," Boone sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. He looked at Walter. "Talk to her. Walter, maybe she will listen to a man of her own generation." Walter cleared his throat, stepping forward. He smelled of bay rum and nervousness. "Clara, please, you have to look at the numbers. The debt is $300, with the interest compounding and the feed prices. You cannot dig your way out of this." He reached out, his soft hand trying to take hers. Clara pulled back sharply. Uncle Silas is making a generous offer, Walter continued, his hand dropping to his side. He will forgive the entire debt, every cent. He will pay off the lien at the bank. All you have to do is sign the deed over to the Boone Ranch. And, well, marry me? Clara stared at him. The audacity of it took her breath away. It was a transaction. She was being purchased, like a broodmare thrown in to sweeten a cattle deal. And then what? Clara asked, her voice shaking with rage. I become Mrs. Walter Prine. I move into a house in town, and Silas levels this place to the ground? Walter looked at his shoes. It is better than losing it all to foreclosure. Clara, we could have a good life. I care for you. You know I do. You care for the land my father died for. Clara spat. You care for the water rights that run under this dirt. Do not pretend this is about affection. Walter, you are just the pen Silas is using to sign the check. Boone stood up from the desk. The casual air evaporated. He towered over her, the menace suddenly radiating off him like heat from a stove. You are a foolish girl, he said quietly. You think pride pays the bills? You think this town cares about your struggle? They are laughing at you. They are waiting for you to fall. Let them wait, Clara said. Boone stepped closer. He invaded her personal space, forcing her to step back until she hit the wall. Cobb straightened up by the door, his hand dropping to his belt. This is a hard country, Boone whispered. It eats people who are too stubborn to bend. Accidents happen all the time. Fires, falls, especially to women without male protection. It would be a tragedy if something happened to you, Clara, or to that drifter you keep like a pet. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Is that a threat, Mr. Boone? It is an observation, Boone said, stepping back and adjusting his cuffs. Think on it tonight, but do not take too long. My patience is wearing thin, and the bank manager is a nervous man. Come, Walter. They left. Walter casting one last, apologetic glance over his shoulder before following his uncle. Cobb gave Clara a wink that was uglier than a curse and shut the door behind him. Clara stood in the silence, her chest heaving. She felt dirty, as if their presence had left a film on her skin. She walked to the wash basin and splashed water on her face, scrubbing hard, but the feeling did not go away. Outside, the first rumble of thunder rolled down from the mountains, low and angry. 2 days later, the sickness started. It began with the bay gelding in the third stall. He was lethargic, his coat dull, refusing his grain. By noon, 2 of the other boarders were displaying the same symptoms, sweating, shifting their weight uncomfortably, their eyes glazed with pain. Clara was in a panic. She knew horses, she knew colic, she knew fever, but this was hitting them all at once. Jonah came in from the back lot, wiping grease from his hands. He took one look at the bay and frowned. How long has he been like this? Jonah asked, stepping into the stall. He lifted the horse's lip to check the gums. They were pale and tacky. Just since this morning, Clara said, her voice high with worry. I thought it was the heat, but now the others... Jonah walked to the water trough. It was half full. He dipped his hand in, smelled the water, then tasted a drop on the tip of his finger. He spat it out immediately. Do not let them drink any more, he ordered sharply. Dump the troughs, scrub them out. What is it? Clara asked, grabbing a bucket. Jonah did not answer. He was already walking out the back door, heading toward the pipe that fed the livery from the main spur line. The water system was simple, a gravity-fed iron pipe that ran from the town's main tank, buried shallowly in the dirt, surfacing near the creek bed before feeding into the livery's cistern. Jonah followed the line, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The sun was beating down, a relentless hammer. He found it 100 yards out, in a cluster of sagebrush near the dried-up wash. The ground was muddy here, a stark contrast to the dust around it. Jonah knelt. The pipe had not burst from pressure. It had been dug up. There were shovel marks in the clay. A section of the iron pipe had been hacked at, a rough hole punched into the metal, and something had been poured in before the leak started saturating the ground. He smelled the faint, chemical tang of lye or maybe sheep dip. It was crude, but effective. It would sicken the animals. Maybe kill them if they drank enough, but it would look like bad water from the drought. He looked at the ground around the mud. The tracks were distinct. A heavy boot, with a unique wear pattern on the heel, the leather worn down on the outside edge. He had seen that walk before. He had seen it on Ed Cobb. Jonah stood up. His jaw set. He walked back to the livery. Clara was scrubbing the last trough, her face streaked with tears and sweat. "Is it the pipe?" "Someone cut the line," Jonah said flatly. "And they poisoned what was left in the pipe. It is lye, I think. Diluted, but enough to make them sick." Clara dropped the brush. "Poison. They poisoned the horses." Jonah nodded. He grabbed a shovel from the wall. "I am going to dig a diversion ditch from the rain barrel. Try to get some clean water flowing if the storm breaks. But Clara, we need to talk." He worked while he talked, his movements efficient and angry. Clara paced the aisle, checking the horses. "You need to leave," Jonah said, driving the shovel into the hard dirt. Clara stopped pacing. "Excuse me. Pack what you can carry. Sell the stock to the freighter who comes through on Friday. Get on the stagecoach and go." "No," Clara said. Jonah stopped digging. He leaned on the shovel handle, looking at her with hard, serious eyes. "This is not a game. Clara, poisoning stock is a hanging offense, which means the men doing it do not care about the law. They do not care about rules. Boone is escalating. First threats, now this. Next time it will not be a horse that gets hurt." "I am not running," Clara said, her voice trembling but fierce. "If I run, he wins. If I run, he takes the land, and he does the same thing to the next person who gets in his way. He does it to the widow Miller down the road. He does it to the shopkeepers." "You cannot fight an army with a pitchfork," Jonah said. "You are one woman against a man who owns the sheriff and the bank. It is suicide." "And what would you have me do?" Clara shouted, stepping toward him. "You want me to be like everyone else? Bow down? Kiss his ring? I thought you of all people understood what it means to stand your ground." "I do understand," Jonah said softly. "That is why I'm telling you to go, because I know what happens when you stand your ground against men like that. You get buried in it." He walked over to her, looming tall and dusty. "I have seen towns like this burn. Clara, I have seen good people die for principles that did not matter once the dirt was thrown over their faces. You have a life ahead of you. Do not throw it away for a patch of dry earth." Clara looked up at him. She saw the fear in his eyes, not fear for himself, but fear for her. It hit her with the force of a physical blow. He cared. This worn-out, dangerous drifter was terrified of losing her. "I cannot," she whispered. "This is my home. My father is buried on that hill. My mother is buried beside him. If I leave them to Boone. I cannot do that." Jonah stared at her for a long moment. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the fire in her dark eyes. He saw a courage that shamed him. He had run from his ghosts. She was standing amidst hers, fighting. "You are a fool." "Clara Hayes," he said, but his voice lacked its usual edge. It was thick with something else. "Maybe," Clara said. He reached out, almost involuntarily, and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "You are braver than most men I have ridden with," he said. "And I have ridden with men who charged cannons." Clara felt a flush rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat. His gray eyes were intense, searching hers. She felt that pull again, that terrifying gravity. She wanted to lean into his hand. She wanted to close her eyes, but the moment was too heavy, too fraught with danger. She needed to break the tension before she did something reckless, like kiss him. She swatted his hand away, though not unkindly, and forced a laugh. "You sound like my father," she said, turning back to the horses. "Older, grumpier, and trying to boss me around. If you are done lecturing, Mr. Carver, we have water to haul." Jonah's hand lingered in the air for a second before he dropped it. A small, crooked smile touched his lips. A rare thing. "Yes, ma'am," he said, older and bossy. "I will keep that in mind. The storm that had been threatening all week finally broke that night, but it was a dry storm. Lightning sheeted across the sky, silent and white, illuminating the town in strobe light flashes. But no rain fell. The wind picked up, whipping through the valley, stripping the leaves from the cottonwoods and rattling the loose shingles on the livery roof. Clara slept fitfully in her small room at the front of the barn. She dreamed of dry riverbeds and snakes made of silver coins. She woke to a sound that was not the wind. It was a crackling, snapping sound, like someone stepping on dry twigs, but louder, continuous. Then she smelled it. Smoke! She sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. The orange glow was already flickering under her door. "Fire!" she screamed, throwing off the quilt and scrambling for the door. "Fire! Jonah!" She burst into the main aisle of the barn and was hit by a wall of heat. The rear of the livery, where the hay storage was already an inferno. The dry hay, cured by the drought and the relentless heat, had gone up like gunpowder. Flames licked up the walls, curling toward the loft where Jonah slept. The horses were screaming. It was a terrible, high-pitched sound that tore at Clara's soul. They were thrashing in their stalls, kicking against the wood, their eyes rolling white with terror. Clara ran toward the stalls, coughing as the thick, black smoke filled her lungs. "Get up!" Heavy smoke rolled along the ceiling. A shape dropped from the loft, landing heavily in the aisle amidst the swirling sparks. It was Jonah. He was shirtless, his suspenders hanging loose, his hair wild. "Get the door!" Jonah roared, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "Open the main doors." Clara scrambled to the front, throwing the heavy latches. She shoved the doors open, and the rush of fresh oxygen fed the fire, making it roar louder, a hungry, sucking sound. She ran back. Jonah was at the first stall, the one with the sick bay gelding. He threw his jacket over the horse's head to blind it, grabbing the halter. "Go!" Clara screamed, slapping the horse's flank. The horse bolted toward the open door and the night outside. Jonah was already moving to the next stall. The heat was blistering. Embers rained down like hellfire hail, singeing their hair and clothes. "Get the tack!" Jonah shouted at her, shoving her toward the tack room. "If we lose the saddles, we lose the business. Go!" Clara hesitated, looking at the horses still trapped, but she saw the logic. She ran to the tack room, grabbing armfuls of bridles and saddles, dragging them out into the dirt of the street. The town was waking up. She heard shouts, the clang of the church bell ringing the alarm. People were running with buckets, but it was futile. The fire was too big, too fast. Clara ran back inside. Jonah was fighting with the old mare, Bessie. She was down, panicked, her legs tangling in the straw. The fire had reached the rafters above her stall. A beam groaned, a sound like a dying giant. "Jonah!" Clara screamed. Jonah was inside the stall, pulling at the mare's head, trying to get her up. "Come on, girl, up, up!" The roof gave way. It didn't collapse entirely, but a massive crossbeam, wreathed in flame, sheared off and swung down. It smashed into the stall divider, shattering the wood and pinning Jonah against the back wall. Jonah grunted, a sharp expulsion of air, as the burning timber grazed his shoulder and slammed into his thigh. Clara didn't think. She ran into the stall. The heat was unbearable. Her eyebrows singed, her skin felt tight and blistered. "Help me!" she shrieked, grabbing Jonah's arm. Jonah was pinned, the heavy wood pressing against his leg. He shoved at it, his face twisted in a rictus of pain and effort. His skin was red, burned by the proximity of the wood. "Leave it!" Jonah yelled at her. "Get out, Clara! It is coming down! I am not leaving you!" Clara grabbed the beam. It was hot, searing her palms, but she pulled. She pulled with everything she had, screaming with the effort. Together, with a heave that strained every muscle in their bodies, they shifted the timber just enough. Jonah scrambled free, his leg dragging, blood streaming from a gash in his shoulder where a nail had torn him open. They looked at Bessie. The mare was thrashing, her back broken by the falling debris. Her eyes met Clara's. There was nothing they could do. The fire was consuming the stall. "No!" Clara screamed, reaching for the horse. Jonah grabbed her around the waist. She fought him, striking at his chest, sobbing. "No! Bessie! No! She is gone! Clara! She is gone!" Jonah shouted, dragging her back. He hauled her bodily out of the stall, shielding her with his own body as another section of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. They tumbled out of the barn doors and into the dirt of the street just as the main roof collapsed inward with a sound like a thunderclap. A geyser of sparks shot 100 feet into the air, lighting up the town like noon. Clara lay in the dirt, coughing, her lungs burning. She scrambled up, staring at the ruin of her life. The livery was a skeleton of fire against the black sky. The smell of burning horsehair and wood was thick and oily. Jonah lay beside her, breathing hard. His shoulder was bleeding freely, soaking his shirt. His arm was blistered. He sat up, wincing, and looked at the fire with dead, cold eyes. Townsfolk were standing in a wide circle, buckets useless in their hands. They watched the flames with a mixture of awe and fear. Clara buried her face in her hands and wept. She wept for Bessie. She wept for the tack that was burning. She wept for her father's legacy turning to ash. Jonah reached out and put his good hand on her shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just held on to her as the world burned. Dawn came gray and quiet. The wind had died, leaving the town shrouded in the acrid haze of the aftermath. The livery was gone. Only the blackened chimney of the office and a few charred posts remained. Smoke still curled lazily from the debris pile. Clara sat on a water trough across the street, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She watched the smoke rise. Jonah sat on the ground near her, leaning against a wagon wheel. He had bound his shoulder with a strip of torn shirt. He looked like a statue carved from ash and pain. A buggy rolled down the street. It was Silas Boone, with Walter Prine sitting beside him. They looked impossibly clean in the gray morning light. Boone stepped down, shaking his head. He walked toward Clara, his face arranged in a mask of somber pity. "A tragedy," Boone said softly. "A terrible tragedy. I told Walter just last night that with this drought, everything is a tinderbox. One spark, one moment of carelessness." He looked at the smoking ruins. "I assume you were insured, Miss Hayes." But no, the rates were too high. Were they not? Clara looked up at him. Her voice was a croak. "You know I was not." Boone sighed. "I am truly sorry. Clara, I know how much this place meant to you, but perhaps this is a sign. The Lord has a way of closing doors so that others may open." Walter stepped forward, wringing his hands. "Clara, you are ruined. You have no feed, no barn, no income. Please, let Uncle Silas help. He can clear the debris. He can buy the land for a fair price, even now, with the damage. It is the only way." Jonah stood up. He moved slowly, favoring his bad leg, but he moved with a menace that made Walter take a step back. Jonah walked until he was standing between Clara and the men. He smelled of smoke and blood. Carelessness. Jonah rasped, "Is that what we are calling arson now?" Boone's eyes narrowed. "Be careful. Drifter, you are speaking to your betters. I am speaking to a man who hires cowards to do his dirty work," Jonah said. His voice carried in the morning air. The crowd of townsfolk, the baker, the smith, the reverend, had gathered closer, listening. "We found the water line cut yesterday," Jonah said, addressing the crowd. "Poison in the pipe, and this fire started in the hay storage. At the back, away from the lanterns. It started on the outside wall. I smelled the coal oil." The crowd murmured. They looked at Boone, then at Jonah. Boone did not flinch. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Coal oil? Poison? You have a vivid imagination. Mr. Carver, or perhaps a guilty conscience." Boone turned to the crowd, spreading his hands. "We all know who this man is. A drifter, a hired gun from the border, a man who has lived by violence his whole life. And since he rode into town, what have we seen? Trouble, threats, and now fire." He looked back at Jonah. "Maybe you knocked over a lantern in a drunken stupor. Or maybe—" Maybe you set the fire yourself, to make yourself a hero, to manipulate a young, vulnerable woman into needing you even more. That is a lie, Clara cried, standing up and dropping the blanket. He saved the horses. He almost died pulling me out. Walter stepped in, his voice soft, reasonable, insidious. Clara, you are in shock. You do not know what you are saying. Look at him. Look at the violence he carries. Reverend Gable was just saying yesterday that trouble follows men like him. Maybe he brought this on you. Maybe his enemies found him here. The crowd shifted. The seeds of doubt, planted in fertile soil of prejudice, began to sprout. He does have a reputation, someone muttered. Never had fires before he came. Another whispered. Boone saw the turn. He pressed his advantage. Miss Hayes, Boone said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic purr. We are only thinking of you. This man, he is not one of us. He is a danger to you and to this town. For your own good. He needs to go. Walter nodded eagerly. If he leaves, Clara, the town will rally. We will help you. Uncle Silas will help you. But not while you are harboring a man who attracts this kind of destruction. Jonah looked at the faces in the crowd. He saw fear. He saw suspicion. He saw the easy, comfortable lie winning over the hard truth. They wanted to believe Boone, because if Boone was the villain, they were cowards for letting him rule. But if Jonah was the villain, they were just protecting their town. Jonah turned to Clara. He saw her face, stricken, torn. She looked at the ruin of her barn, then at him. She was trembling. She was 25 years old, and she had lost everything in a single night. He saw the terror in her eyes, not of him, but of the abyss opening up beneath her feet. Clara, Walters said, reaching out a hand. Send him away. Save yourself. The silence stretched tight as a bowstring. Clara looked at Jonah, her eyes pleading for an answer, for a way out. But there was only the smoke, the ash, and the waiting vultures. The afternoon light was gray and weak, filtering through the jagged gaps in the roof where the fire had eaten through the shingles. The loft smelled of wet ash, charred pine, and the sharp, acrid scent of ruin. It was a smell that stuck to the back of the throat, a constant reminder of what had been lost in the span of a single night. Jonah Carver moved stiffly in the gloom. Every movement sent a fresh spike of pain through his left shoulder, where the falling timber had torn the skin and bruised the muscle deep down to the bone. He had bound it with a strip of clean linen, but the blood had already soaked through, a dark stain against the white cloth. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he tightened the straps on his bedroll. He was leaving. It was the only decision that made sense. The logic of it was cold and hard, like iron. Silas Boone had won, not with the fire, not even with the poison, but with the words he had spoken in the street that morning. He had turned the town's fear into a weapon, and he had aimed it squarely at Clara. As long as Jonah stayed, Clara was tainted. As long as he stood beside her, she was a target. Jonah looked at his saddlebags resting on a crate. They held everything he owned in the world: a change of clothes, a box of cartridges, a razor, and a few tins of food. It was a pathetic sum for a lifetime of living. He felt a heavy, hollow ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. It was the old familiar weight of exile. He had felt it leaving Texas. He had felt it leaving the border. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like tearing off a limb. He reached for his hat, dusting the soot from the brim. He would ride out before sunset. He would not say goodbye. It would be cleaner that way. Less painful for her. She could tell the town she fired him. She could tell Boone she'd come to her senses. Maybe then they would leave her alone. The sound of boots on the ladder made him freeze. They were light steps, but hurried, angry. Jonah did not turn around. He focused on the buckle of his saddlebag, his jaw setting hard. Going somewhere. Mr. Carver. Clara's voice was breathless, tight with exertion and something that sounded dangerously like fury. Jonah finished the buckle and turned slowly. Clara stood at the top of the ladder. She was still wearing the soot-stained dress from the night before, her face smudged with gray, her hair pulling loose from its pins. Her eyes were dark, burning holes in him. "It is time to move on," Jonah said. His voice sounded rough, scraped raw by the smoke. "Move on," Clara repeated. She stepped into the loft, the floorboards creaking under her boots. "Just like that. You pack your bag and you ride into the sunset. It is for the best." "Clara, do not tell me what is for the best," she shouted. Her voice cracked, echoing in the empty, charred space. "Do not you dare stand there and decide my life for me." Jonah took a step toward her, his hand raised in a placating gesture. "Listen to me. You heard Boone. You heard the town. As long as I am here, they have an excuse to hurt you. They think I am the danger. If I leave, the heat dies down. You can salvage this." "Salvage what?" Clara gestured wildly at the blackened rafters. "It is gone. Jonah, the barn is gone. The horses are gone. There is nothing to salvage but the dirt. And Boone will take that whether you are here or not. He will back off if I am gone," Jonah insisted. "Walter Prine can help you. He has the money. He has the influence. Walter Prine!" Clara spat the name like a curse. "You want me to go to Walter Prine? You want me to sell myself to the man standing next to the arsonist who burned my livelihood? Is that your solution?" "It is survival," Jonah said, his voice hardening. "It is the only play you have left. I am an old dog. Clara, I have brought you nothing but trouble." Clara walked up to him, close enough that he could see the tears standing in her eyes. Tears she refused to let fall. "Is that what you think this is? Trouble? I think I am a man with a past that is dragging you under," Jonah said. "I think I looked at you and forgot for a minute that men like me do not get to have nice things. We do not get a home. We do not get peace. We just get to watch it burn." "So you run," Clara said. "You sneak off like a hired hand who stole the silver. You do not even have the courage to look me in the eye and say goodbye." "I am looking you in the eye now," Jonah said softly, "and it is killing me. So let me go." "Clara, before I make it worse." He reached for his bedroll. Clara shoved him. It was not a gentle push. She slammed her hands against his chest with all her strength. Jonah stumbled back, surprised, grabbing a support beam to steady himself. "You coward," she hissed. "You are not leaving to save me. You are leaving because you are scared. I am terrified," Jonah roared back, his control finally snapping. "I am terrified that the next time I wake up, it will be you in the fire. I am terrified that because I want to stay, because I want to be near you, I am going to get you killed." Clara went still. The silence rushed back in, heavy and thick. "You want to stay?" she whispered. Jonah looked away, breathing hard. His chest heaved. The confession hung in the air, undeniable. "Yes, then stay," she said. "Fight with me." "I cannot fight this," Jonah said, shaking his head. "I can shoot men, I can punch cattle, I can fix a fence, but I cannot fight a whole town's judgment. I cannot fight the fact that I am 48 years old, broke and broken down. Look at me, Clara. I am held together by scar tissue and bad memories." He gestured to his body, to the blood seeping through the bandage on his shoulder, to the gray in his hair. "You need a future," he said. Not a past." Clara stepped closer again. She reached out, her hand hovering over the bandage on his shoulder, but she pulled it back. She looked at him with a mixture of frustration and a deep, aching longing that terrified her. "You think you are so noble," she said, her voice trembling, "making the hard choice, walking away into the lonely waste. It is pathetic." Jonah flinched. "Pathetic? Yes, you are just giving up. You are letting Boone win because you are too tired to stand up." "I am not tired," Jonah growled. "You are," Clara said. She was crying now, the tears cutting tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "You are tired, and you are hurt, and you are looking for an excuse to lie down and die alone so you do not have to feel anything anymore." "That is not true," Jonah warned, his voice low. "It is true," Clara shouted, pushing him again, though with less force this time. You are done. You are finished. You are too old for this." The words hung there. Too old for this. She meant the fight. She meant the struggle against Boone. She meant the pain of the fire. But the words twisted in the air, taking on a darker, sharper meaning. They struck at the core of his insecurity, the very thing the town had been whispering, the thing he told himself every time he looked in a mirror. Too old for her. Too old to be a man. Jonah went rigid. His eyes went flat and cold. But beneath the ice, a fire ignited that was hotter than the one that had consumed the barn. He looked at Clara. She was breathing fast, her lips parted, realizing perhaps too late how the words had sounded. She looked defiant, but also frightened. Not of him, but of the chasm she had just opened. Jonah dropped his bedroll. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. He took a step toward her. Then another. He did not look like a broken-down drifter now. He looked like the predator he had once been. The man who had survived the border wars. Clara held her ground, though her chin quivered. Jonah stopped inches from her. He towered over her, blocking out the weak light from the roof. He reached out and took her hand, the one she had used to push him. His grip was firm, calloused, swallowing her smaller fingers. He brought her hand up, pressing it against the center of his chest, right over the thudding rhythm of his heart. "Too old," he repeated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her palm. Clara swallowed dryly. "Jonah, is that what you think?" he asked. "You think I am empty? You think the tank is dry? I did not mean—" Clara started, but her voice failed her. Jonah smirked. It was a slow, bitter, dangerous curving of his mouth. It did not reach his eyes. His eyes were focused entirely on her mouth. "Then watch what these hands can do," he whispered. The words were heavy. They carried the weight of a challenge, of a threat, and of a desire so potent it made the air in the loft crackle. He released her hand and brought his own hands up. He cupped her face. His palms were rough, textured like sandpaper, smelling of leather and smoke. His thumbs traced the line of her jaw, brushing away the soot and the tears. Clara stopped breathing. She felt the calluses on his skin, the strength in his fingers. He held her as if she were made of fine glass that he was terrified of shattering. Yet his grip was possessive. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. She saw the gray at his temples, the lines etched by sun and sorrow, and she did not see age. She saw survival. She saw a man who had walked through hell and was standing here, now, for her. "Jonah?" she whispered. "Are you sure?" "Clara," he asked, his voice rough with need. "Because if I kiss you, I am not leaving. I am never leaving." Clara let out a small, broken sound. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled him down. "Do not leave," she breathed against his lips. The tension that had been building for weeks, through the heat and the dust and the labor, finally snapped. Jonah kissed her. It was not gentle at first. It was desperate. It was the collision of two people who had been starving. His mouth was hot and hard on hers, tasting of tobacco and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Clara met him with equal force, her body pressing against his, seeking the solid warmth of him. She felt the groan vibrate in his chest. His arms went around her, pulling her off her feet, crushing her against him. The pain in his shoulder must have been screaming, but he ignored it. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a disintegrating world. They stumbled back, away from the open edge of the loft, until they hit the wall. Jonah pinned her there with his body, his hands roaming over her back, her waist, relearning the shape of her. It was frantic, messy, and overwhelmed by the sheer relief of contact. Clara buried her face in his neck, inhaling the scent of him, smoke and sweat and man. She kissed the pulse point at his throat, feeling it hammer against her lips. Jonah pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were dark, dilated, stripping her bare. He ran his thumb over her bottom lip, swollen from his kiss. "I wanted to do this since the day you yelled at me for fixing the fence," he murmured. "I wanted you to do it sooner," Clara admitted, her voice shaking. He kissed her again, slower this time. deeper. He kissed her like he was memorizing her. His hands moved from her waist to her face, cradling her again. He treated her with a reverence that made her heart ache. These hands, which had dug graves and held guns, touched her with a delicacy that defied his history. They sank down onto the bedroll he had just packed. The dust motes swirled around them in the shafts of light like falling ash. It was not a graceful seduction. It was a huddle. It was two survivors finding shelter in each other. Clara's fingers traced the bandage on his shoulder. Careful and light. She unbuttoned his shirt, pushing the fabric aside to reveal the map of his life. The white puckered scar of a knife wound on his ribs. The burn marks from the fire. The tapestry of violence he carried on his skin. She kissed the scar over his heart. "You are hurt," she whispered. "I do not feel it," Jonah said. He leaned over her, bracing his weight on his good arm. He looked down at her, and the bitterness was gone from his face. There was only a raw, open vulnerability that he had never shown anyone. "You are beautiful, Clara," he said, the words sounding like a confession. "And you are a fool for wanting me." "Then I am a fool," Clara said, reaching up to pull him down. They clung to each other as the sun began to set, casting long, red shadows across the ruined floor. The world outside, Boone, the debt, the judgment of the town, ceased to exist. There was only the rough warmth of the blanket, the smell of smoke, and the frantic, affirming beat of their hearts. Later, the loft was dark. The only light came from the stars visible through the holes in the roof. The wind had picked up again, whistling mournfully through the burnt timbers. They lay side by side on the bedroll, covered by his duster. Jonah was smoking a cigarette, the cherry glowing bright in the darkness. Clara lay with her head on his good shoulder, her hand resting flat on his chest. She could hear the town settling down for the night. A dog barked. A door slammed. "They are going to hate me," Clara said quietly. Her voice sounded small in the darkness. Jonah took a drag of the cigarette and exhaled a stream of smoke. "They already hate you, Clara. They hate you because you are strong. Now they will just have a name for it. They will call me a whore," she said, "for laying with the hired help, for choosing the old drifter over the banker's nephew." "Let them," Jonah said. He turned his head to look at her. "Better a whore than a slave. And that is what you would be with Prine. A bird in a gilded cage." Clara tightened her grip on his shirt. "I know, but it scares me. Not the name, but the isolation. If they cut us off, if no one will trade with us, we will manage." Jonah said, "I have lived on jackrabbit and prickly pear before. We will survive." He fell silent for a moment, watching the smoke curl up toward the stars. "I am scared too," he admitted. Clara looked up. "You?" Jonah nodded. "I am scared that the blood I have spilled is going to wash up on your doorstep. Boone is not done, and now I have something to lose. A man who has something to lose is careful, and careful men get killed." Clara sat up, pulling the duster around her shoulders. She looked down at him. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face. "We cannot be careful then," she said. Jonah looked at her, confused. "What, if being careful gets you killed? Then we have to be something else. We have to be dangerous." Jonah crushed the cigarette out on the floorboards. He sat up, wincing slightly as his shoulder protested. He looked at Clara, and he saw a new hardness in her eyes. The fire had taken her innocence, but it had tempered her spirit like steel. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "Boone thinks he has won," Clara said. "He thinks I am broken. He thinks you are running. He expects me to come crawling to him tomorrow, begging for that offer." "He does," Jonah agreed. "Then I will," Clara said. Jonah frowned, his brow furrowing. "You will what? I will go to him. I will tell him I am beaten. I will tell him you left in the night, a coward running from the law. I will tell him I am ready to discuss the sale." "No," Jonah said immediately. "I am not letting you walk into the lion's den alone." "I have to," Clara insisted. "If he thinks I am defeated, he will get sloppy. He will let his guard down. He needs to believe his plan worked." "And what am I doing while you are serving yourself up on a platter?" Jonah asked, his voice rising. "You are watching," Clara said. "You are going to be exactly what they say you are. The ghost, the drifter. You hide out in the Badlands. You watch his ranch. You watch his men. We need proof. Jonah, we need to know where he is moving the stolen cattle. We need to know who cuts the fences. We need something more than just our word against his." Jonah stared at her. It was a dangerous plan. It relied on Clara playing a role that would grate against every fiber of her being. It required her to swallow her pride and smile at the men who had burned her home. "He will want an answer about Prine," Jonah warned. "He will push for the marriage. I will stall," Clara said. "I will tell him a woman needs time to mourn her losses before she thinks of weddings. I will play the grieving, confused girl." Jonah reached out and took her hand. He squeezed it hard. "If he touches you," Jonah said, his voice dark and flat, "if he so much as lays a finger on you, I will kill him," Clara finished. "Or you will." Jonah looked at their joined hands. His, large, scarred, stained with soot. Hers, smaller, but gripping his with a strength that surprised him. "We are playing a dangerous game. Clara, if they catch me spying, they will hang me. And if they find out you are lying, then we go down fighting," Clara said. "Together." Jonah looked at her for a long time. He saw the fear in her. Yes, but he also saw the love. It was a fierce, jagged thing, born of disaster. But it was real. Together. He agreed. He leaned in and kissed her again. It was different this time. It was not the desperate collision of before. It was a seal, a pact. It was the kiss of two conspirators who had just declared war on the world. Jonah pulled back. "Get some sleep, Clara. You have a performance to give in the morning." "And you?" she asked. Jonah stood up, moving to the edge of the loft to look out at the sleeping, hostile town. He checked the load in his revolver, the click of the cylinder loud in the quiet night. "I have some work to do." He looked back at her, and the smirk returned, the one that said he was not too old. Not for this, not for her. "My hands have been idle for too long," he said softly. "Time to put them back to work." Clara lay back down, watching his silhouette against the stars. She felt a cold dread in her stomach at what they were about to do, but beneath it, a warm, steady burn. She was not alone. The drifter had stayed, and God help Silas Boone when the old dog finally decided to bite. The ride to the Boone ranch took Clara through the belly of the drought. The land here was different than the scrub surrounding her own property. It was greener, lush in an unnatural way that spoke of diverted creeks and deep wells that sucked the earth dry for miles around. She rode the gray mare Jonah had managed to borrow from a sympathetic, if terrified, neighbor. She wore her Sunday dress, stained now with the gray dust of the road, and she kept her head low, practicing the slump of the defeated. It was a role she had to play perfectly. The ranch house rose from the valley floor like a fortress. It was a sprawling two-story structure of whitewashed timber and stone, surrounded by manicured oaks that drank more water in a day than a family drank in a week. Clara tightened her grip on the reins. Her heart was a frantic bird battering against her ribs, but her face was a mask of grim resignation. She rode past the main gate, nodding to the armed guard who watched her with a sneer. She dismounted at the hitching rail. A stable boy, no older than 12, came running to take the reins. Clara noted the dark purple bruise blooming across his cheekbone and the way he flinched when she raised her hand to adjust her hat. "Careful with her," Clara said softly. "Yes, ma am," the boy whispered, keeping his eyes on his boots. "Mr. Boone is in the study. He is expecting you." Clara walked toward the house, but her eyes were darting, recording everything. To the east, behind the main barn, she saw a series of low sheds that were not on the county maps. Through the slats of the fence, she saw cattle packed tight, their ribs showing. They were not Boone's prize stock. They were diverse breeds, mixed brands, stolen herds, likely, or cattle bought for pennies from desperate homesteaders and penned up to be fattened once the market broke. High above the valley, nestled in a cluster of granite boulders that overlooked the ranch, Jonah Carver lowered his spyglass. He lay flat on his stomach, the heat of the rock seeping into his chest. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, heavy rhythm, but he ignored it. He was working. He scanned the perimeter, counting 4 men on the porch, 2 by the barn, 1 patrolling the ridge line to the west. It was a fortress. The ravine leading up to the house was narrow, a choke point. If things went wrong, there was only one way out, and it was a shooting gallery. Jonah adjusted the brim of his hat. Shading his eyes, he checked the load in his Winchester, sliding a fresh cartridge into the chamber. He watched Clara walk up the steps. She looked small against the massive white doors. "Do not do anything stupid. Clara," he whispered to the wind. "Just get the proof and get out, inside." The house smelled of beeswax and expensive cigars. A maid showed Clara into the study, a room lined with leather-bound books that looked like they had never been opened. Silas Boone sat behind a massive mahogany desk, and Walter Prine stood by the window, swirling a glass of amber liquid. "Clara," Boone said, not rising, "I am glad you came to your senses." Clara stood in the center of the room, clutching her handbag. "I did not have much choice. Did I?" "The fire took everything," Boone smiled, a magnanimous expression that made Clara's skin crawl. "Tragedy has a way of clarifying things. Have you brought the deed?" "I have it." Clara lied. She patted her bag. "But I need to know the terms are what you promised. Full forgiveness of the debt and the cash payment." Walter turned from the window. "And the marriage, Clara, that is part of the arrangement. It ensures your security." Clara looked at him. He looked soft, pliable, a man made of dough. "And yours, Walter. I imagine your uncle's influence will be good for your career at the bank." Boone chuckled. "Walter has a bright future. We are building an empire here. Clara, this valley is just the beginning." He opened a ledger on his desk, turning it around for her to see. Clara stepped forward, her eyes scanning the page. It was a list of names. Miller, Johnson, Henderson. Her own name was near the bottom, crossed out in red ink. Next to the names were dates and notes. Water rights acquired. Grazing lease terminated. Accident. Her breath hitched. Accident. It was written next to the Miller entry. Old man Miller had fallen from his loft 3 months ago. "You own it all," she said, her voice trembling. "Not all," Boone corrected. "Not yet, but the drought is doing the heavy lifting for us. Once the water table drops another foot, the northern homesteads will fold. We will pick them up for the cost of the back taxes. And if they do not fold?" Clara asked, pushing her luck. Boone leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Then we help nature along. A cut fence here, a dry well there. People get discouraged easily. Clara, like you held out longer than most. I will give you that. But in the end, everyone breaks." "Like the water line," Clara said. "And the fire." Boone's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked at Walter, then back at Clara. The silence in the room grew heavy. "You are asking a lot of questions for a woman who just wants to sign a paper," Boone said slowly. Clara realized her mistake. She had let the anger bleed into her voice. She tried to backtrack, to summon the fear. I want to know that it is over. I want to know I am safe." "You are safe as long as you are useful," Boone said. He stood up. "Let me see the deed." "Clara." Clara hesitated. Her hand went to her bag, but she did not open it. She looked at the ledger, then at the map on the wall behind him. It showed the entire valley, with red lines drawn through the properties he intended to take. Boone walked around the desk. He moved with a predator's grace. "Give me the bag," he ordered. Clara took a step back. "I changed my mind." Boone stopped. "Excuse me, I changed my mind," Clara said, her voice rising. "I am not selling, and I am not marrying him." Walter looked panicked. "Clara, be reasonable. You cannot walk out of here." Boone did not look panicked. He looked bored. He sighed, shaking his head. "I told you, Walter, she is stubborn. She needs to be broken, not wooed." Boone snapped his fingers. The door to the study opened, and Ed Cobb stepped in, grinning. Check her bag, Boone said, and then take her to the tack room. Teach her about obedience. Keep her alive, but make sure she understands that saying no is not an option anymore. Cobb lunged for her. Clara swung the heavy leather handbag with all her strength. The brass clasp connected with Cobb's nose with a sickening crunch. Cobb yelled, stumbling back, blood spurting. Clara turned and ran. She burst through the French doors onto the veranda, glass shattering around her. "Get her!" Boone roared from inside. Clara scrambled over the railing, dropping into the flower bed below. She heard boots pounding on the wood above her. A gunshot cracked, the bullet kicking up dirt inches from her foot. She ran toward the horses, but two men were already running from the bunkhouse, cutting her off. Then the hillside erupted. A rifle shot echoed from the rocks, a flat, hard crack that rolled through the valley. One of the men running toward Clara spun around, his leg collapsing under him as a bullet tore through his thigh. "Jonah!" Clara screamed. Jonah was moving. He was sliding down a scree slope on the west side of the house, raising a cloud of dust. He fired again, working the lever of the Winchester with a blur of speed. Dust puffed on the porch railing, forcing Boone and Cobb back inside. "Clara, get down!" Jonah shouted. He hit the flat ground and sprinted toward her, favoring his bad leg but moving with a terrible, focused momentum. He was not shooting to suppress, he was shooting to kill. Another gunman appeared around the corner of the stable. He raised a shotgun. Jonah dropped to one knee, ignoring the exposure. He fired. The gunman jerked backward, the shotgun discharging into the dirt. Clara scrambled behind a water trough. The air was filled with the angry buzz of hornets as bullets chewed into the wood. She looked around for a weapon. The gunman Jonah had shot was lying 10 feet away. His rifle lay in the dust. Clara crawled. The dirt tore at her dress. She reached the rifle, a heavy Henry repeater. She dragged it back behind the trough just as Cobb appeared on the veranda, a pistol in each hand. Jonah was pinned down behind a rain barrel. Splinters flew from the wood as Cobb fired. Clara lifted the rifle. It was heavy, heavier than she expected. Her hands were shaking so hard she could hear the lever rattle. She rested the barrel on the edge of the trough. She did not aim for Cobb. She aimed for the chaotic movement on the porch. She pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised her shoulder, and the shot went high, shattering a window above Cobb's head. But it was enough. Cobb ducked, startled by the return fire from a second direction. Jonah used the second of distraction. He broke cover, sprinting the last 20 yards to the horses. He vaulted onto the back of the gray mare, grabbing the reins of a roan gelding tied next to it. "Clara, move!" Clara abandoned the cover of the trough. She ran, her lungs burning. Bullets kicked up geysers of dirt around her heels. She reached Jonah, and he reached down, his arm hooking around her waist. With a heave that made him grunt with pain, he swung her up behind him on the gray. "Hold on!" He kicked the mare, and the horse surged forward. He released the roan, slapping its flank to send it running into the path of the other men, creating a wall of confused horseflesh. They tore out of the main gate, the mare's hooves hammering the hard-packed earth. Behind them, shouts and more gunfire erupted, but they were already turning off the main road, heading straight for the broken ground of the foothills. The sky, which had been threatening all day, finally broke open. It did not rain. It deluged. A curtain of water swept across the valley, turning the world gray and blurring the shapes of the men mounting up behind them. "Head for the ridge," Jonah shouted over the wind. "The mud will slow them down." They rode hard. The mare was strong, but she was carrying double weight. They scrambled up a narrow deer trail, the brush whipping at their faces. The rain turned the dust instantly into slick, treacherous mud. The horse slipped, scrambling for purchase, her iron shoes striking sparks on hidden rocks. Behind them, the pursuit was disorganized but dogged. Clara looked back, squinting against the rain. She saw dark shapes moving through the downpour. 4 or 5 riders. "They are coming!" she yelled. Jonah did not look back. He kept his eyes on the trail. He knew this country. He knew the box canyons and the drop-offs. Lightning split the sky, a jagged fork of white fire that struck a pine tree on the peak above them. The thunder was immediate, a physical blow that shook the ground. The temperature plummeted. The rain, which had been warm, turned icy. Within minutes, it was sleet, sharp, stinging pellets that coated the rocks in a deadly glaze of ice. "We have to lose them," Jonah yelled. "We cannot fight them in this." He hauled the mare to the left, forcing her off the trail and into a thick stand of aspen. It was a dangerous maneuver. The slope was steep, covered in loose shale hidden by wet leaves. The horse slid, sitting back on her haunches, sliding 10 feet before finding grip. They navigated the trees in silence. The only sound, the roar of the storm and the heaving breath of the horse. An hour passed. The sun set, or simply vanished behind the storm clouds, plunging the mountains into an abyssal darkness. The pursuit had faded. Boone's men were hired guns, not mountain men. They would not risk their necks on an icy cliffside in the dark for a paycheck. Jonah slowed the horse to a walk. He was shivering violently. The tremors vibrating through Clara's body pressed against his back. "There is a cabin," he rasped. "An old trapper's line shack, up near the crest." They found it by luck as much as memory. It was a squat, ugly structure of rough-hewn logs, half buried in a snowdrift that had survived the summer in the deep shade. The roof sagged dangerously, and the door hung on one leather hinge. They dismounted. Jonah's legs buckled when he hit the ground, and he had to grab the stirrup to stay upright. Clara was numb, her fingers frozen into claws. "Get inside," Jonah ordered. They led the horse into the lee of the cabin, tying her where the overhang offered some shelter. Then they pushed into the darkness of the shack. It smelled of rat droppings and ancient pine needles. The wind whistled through the chinking in the logs, but it was out of the sleet. Jonah fumbled in his pocket for a match. His hands were shaking so badly, he dropped the first 2. The third flared to life. There was a stone fireplace in the corner, blackened with soot. A meager pile of dry wood sat next to it, left by the last occupant perhaps years ago. Clara knelt, feeding kindling into the small flame. She blew on it gently, coaxing it to life. When the fire finally caught, casting a weak orange glow around the room, she turned to Jonah. He was standing by the door, leaning heavily against the wall. His face was gray, his lips blue. He was soaked to the bone, his shirt clinging to him like a second skin. "We need to get dry," Clara said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "The hypothermia." Jonah nodded dumbly. They had no dry clothes. The saddlebags were gone, left on the roan gelding back at the ranch. There was only the fire and a single, moth-eaten wool blanket lying on a primitive bunk in the corner. Clara stood up. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her sodden dress. Shame was a luxury they could not afford. The cold was a predator that was already in the room with them. She stripped down to her chemise and drawers, hanging the wet dress on a nail near the fire. Her skin was covered in goose flesh, pale and shivering. Jonah watched her, his eyes glassy. He tried to unbutton his shirt, but his fingers wouldn't work. "Let me," Clara said. She stepped to him. She undid the buttons, peeling the wet fabric away from his skin. The bandage on his shoulder was soaked, pink with diluted blood. She helped him out of the shirt, then his boots, then his trousers. He stood before her in his long underwear, shivering so hard his teeth clicked together. "Come here," she whispered. She led him to the bunk. She wrapped the rough wool blanket around both of them and pulled him down onto the straw mattress. They huddled together, limbs tangled, seeking the friction of warmth. Clara pressed her front against his back, wrapping her arms around his chest. She could feel the heat slowly returning to him, fighting the chill that had settled deep in his bones. For a long time, there was only the sound of the wind rattling the door and their breathing. Then, as the shivering subsided, the nature of the embrace changed. The desperate clutch for survival softened into something else. Clara shifted, turning Jonah so he faced her. The firelight played across his face, highlighting the deep lines of fatigue and the scar that ran down his cheek. "We made it," she whispered. Jonah looked at her. His eyes were dark, full of shadows and fire. "You should not be here." "Clara, you should be safe. I am safe," she said. "I am with you." Jonah let out a ragged sigh. He reached up, his hand trembling, and traced the line of her jaw. "You are looking at a ruin. Clara, a washed-up old man who dragged you into a war." Clara caught his hand. She turned it over, kissing the calloused palm. She kissed the scar on his wrist. She kissed the burn mark on his forearm. "I am looking at the man who came back for me," she said fiercely. "I am looking at the hands that saved me." She ran her fingers over his chest, tracing the white puckered scar of the bullet wound he had told her about, the one from the border. She traced the lines of age around his eyes as if she were mapping a country she intended to live in. "Every mark," she whispered. "Every year. I want them all." Jonah closed his eyes, a shudder running through him that had nothing to do with the cold. "You do not know what you are asking for. The things I have done, the things I carry, I do not care," Clara said. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "I'm not asking for a saint. Jonah, I am asking for you." She kissed him. It was slow, tasting of rain and smoke. Jonah responded with a groan, his arms tightening around her, pulling her flush against him. The blanket slipped, skin pressing against skin. There was no hesitation this time. The fear of the chase, the terror of the shooting, it all transmuted into a frantic need to affirm that they were alive. Jonah kissed her neck, her shoulder, murmuring her name like a prayer. He treated her body with a desperate reverence, his rough hands moving over her with an agonizing gentleness, as if trying to memorize the feel of her before the world tried to take her away again. Clara held him, anchoring him. She kissed the scars he hated, claiming them, in the dark, wet cabin, surrounded by a storm that wanted to kill them. They built a fire between them that pushed back the night. Jonah fell asleep first, exhaustion finally claiming him. Clara lay awake for a while, listening to the sleet peck against the logs. She watched the fire die down to embers. She felt the heavy, steady weight of Jonah's arm across her waist, and for the first time since the fire at the livery, she did not feel afraid. She felt dangerous. Morning came with a brutal, bright clarity. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains coated in a blinding layer of ice and snow. The sun was sharp, cutting through the cracks in the cabin walls. Jonah woke with a start. The instinct of the hunted kicked in before his eyes were fully open. He sat up, reaching for the revolver that lay on the floor beside the bunk. A sharp, biting pain in his side made him gasp. Clara sat up beside him, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Jonah, what is it?" Jonah looked down. The blanket was stained with blood, not from his shoulder. He pulled up the hem of his long underwear. There was a raw, red furrow along his ribs, just above the hip bone. A bullet graze. He must have taken it during the escape, the adrenaline masking the pain until now. Clara stared at the wound, her face draining of color. "You were hit?" Jonah touched the wound. It was shallow, but it had bled freely in the night, a few inches to the left, and it would have been a gut shot, a death sentence. "Just a scratch," he grunted, though he felt lightheaded. Clara scrambled off the bunk. She knelt beside him, inspecting the wound with trembling hands. "It is not just a scratch. Look at the blood. Jonah, you could have died." She looked up at him, and her eyes were wide with a sudden, terrifying realization. The invincibility of the night before vanished. He was flesh and blood. He was breakable. "We cannot keep doing this," she whispered. "Running, dodging bullets. One of these times, they will not miss." Jonah grabbed his trousers, wincing as he pulled them on. "We do not have a choice. Clara, Boone will hunt us until one of us is dead. Then we stop running," Clara said. Her voice was hard, brittle. Jonah paused. "What?" Clara stood up. She walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley below. "We stop running. We go back. To town," Jonah asked, buttoning his shirt. "That is suicide. Boone controls the town. He will have the sheriff arrest us on sight." "He controls the town because they are afraid," Clara said, turning to face him. "He controls them because everything he does is in the dark. The fire, the poison, the threats. It is all whispers and shadows. And you want to do what? Shine a lantern on it. I want to drag it into the street, Clara said. I want to make them look. She walked back to him. She picked up his gun belt from the floor and held it out to him. We have the evidence. Jonah. I heard him admit to the fire. I heard him plan to take the Miller place. I saw the ledger. It is your word against his, Jonah said, buckling the belt. A wealthy rancher against a hysterical woman and a drifter. Not just my word, Clara said. There are others. The stable boy with the bruised face. The Millers. The family I gave grain to. They know. Jonah. They all know. They just need someone to stand up first. Jonah looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had made her run into a burning barn to save a horse. But this was different. This was a cold, calculated resolve. If we go back, he said quietly, there is a good chance I do not walk away from this. Even if we win. I shot men yesterday. There will be a reckoning. I know, Clara said. Her voice broke, but she held his gaze. I know, but if we run, we lose everything. We lose ourselves. I would rather die standing in the dirt of my home than live running like a criminal for a crime I did not commit. Jonah adjusted the holster on his hip. He felt the weight of the iron. He felt the ache in his shoulder and the sting in his side. He looked at the woman who had traced his scars and called them a map. He took her face in his hands. You are a hard woman. Clara Hayes. I learned from the best. She replied. Jonah nodded slowly. All right, we go back. He walked to the door and pushed it open. The cold mountain air rushed in, sharp and cleansing. He looked down toward the town of Blackwood, a smudge of gray smoke in the distance. Let us go finish this, he said. They gathered their meager belongings. Clara put on her ruined, stiff dress. Jonah checked his rifle. They mounted the gray mare, Clara's arms wrapping tight around Jonah's waist. They rode down the mountain, leaving the sanctuary of the high pines, descending back into the world of men, toward a town that would either hang them or save them. The dawn did not break gently over the valley of Blackwood. It arrived as a pale, hard silver, bleeding up from the eastern horizon to illuminate a world frozen in a snap of early winter cold. The frost lay heavy on the sagebrush, coating the thorns in delicate, brittle ice that crunched under the hooves of the gray mare. Jonah Carver and Clara Hayes rode down the center of the main street. They were a sight that stopped the few early risers in their tracks. They rode double on the single horse, the animal's head low with exhaustion, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Jonah sat in the saddle, his face gray with pain, his shirt stained dark with dried blood at the shoulder and side. Clara sat behind him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her face pressed against his back. Her Sunday dress was torn at the hem and stiff with mud, her hair a tangled mane of dark waves. They looked like wreckage. They looked like the survivors of a war no one else knew was being fought. The silence of the town was broken only by the rhythmic clop of hooves on the frozen earth. A curtain twitched in the window of the boarding house. The door to the general store opened, and Henderson stepped out, broom in hand, freezing as he saw them. They did not stop at the livery, for there was no livery left, only a blackened scar on the earth. They rode straight to the church. Jonah pulled the mare up in front of the white-clapboard building. He winced as he shifted his weight, the bullet graze on his side burning like a brand. He felt Clara slide off the back. Her legs were shaky, but she landed on her feet. She walked to the rope that hung by the church door, the one used to call the faithful to service or the town to alarm. She grabbed it with both hands and pulled. The bell clanged. It was a harsh, discordant sound in the quiet morning. She pulled it again, and again. The bronze tongue struck the metal, sending a shock wave through the sleeping town. "Stop it!" Reverend Gable shouted, stumbling out of the parsonage next door, pulling his suspenders over his nightshirt. "Stop that infernal racket! What is the meaning of this?" Clara let go of the rope. She turned to face him. Her eyes were dark holes in her pale face, but they burned with a terrifying intensity. "Get the mare," Clara rasped. Her voice was rough from the smoke and the cold. Get the mayor, get Mr. Prine, get everyone. People were already spilling into the street, wrapping coats over their sleepwear. Mayor Higgins arrived, breathless and red-faced. The blacksmith came, clutching a hammer. Women gathered in clusters, whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting from Clara's torn dress to Jonah's bloody shirt. Jonah remained mounted. He sat like a sentinel, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. He watched the horizon to the west. He knew they did not have long. Within 10 minutes, the street was full. And then came the sound Jonah was waiting for, the thunder of galloping horses. Silas Boone rode in from the west road. He was flanked by Walter Prine and 4 of his hired guns. They pulled up short, their horses dancing and snorting steam, creating a wall of muscle and intimidation between the church and the rest of the town. Boone looked fresh, clean-shaven, and utterly in control. He looked at Clara, then at Jonah, and a small, pitying smile touched his lips. "So," Boone said, his voice carrying easily over the crowd, "the fugitives return. I must say, I expected you to be halfway to Mexico by now." Clara stepped forward. She stood alone in the gap between the town and the gunmen. "I am not running, Silas," she said, "and neither are you. Not anymore." Boone laughed, a sound that lacked any humor. "Sheriff," he called out to the man standing nervously by the barber shop, "arrest these 2. Attempted murder of my men, horse theft, and I believe we can add public disturbance to the list." The sheriff, an older man with a paunch and shifting eyes, stepped forward reluctantly. "Now, Clara, you know you cannot just go shooting up a man's ranch. I shot no one who was not trying to kill me," Clara shouted. She turned to the crowd, spreading her arms. "Look at us. Look at what he did." She pointed a shaking finger at Boone. "He burned the livery. He poisoned the water line." "Lies," Walter Prine shouted from his saddle. He looked pale, sweating despite the cold. "She is hysterical. The fire was an accident. And the water, well, everyone knows the drought makes people imagine things." "I saw the ledger," Clara screamed. "She was not the polite young woman they knew anymore. She was a fury. I saw the book on his desk. He has marked you all down for ruin. Miller, he killed your father. It says so in his book. Accident arranged. Henderson, your mortgage is bought and paid for by him. He is choking this town to death, and you are thanking him for the privilege." The crowd murmured, "Old Mrs." Miller put a hand to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Henderson looked at his boots, his face flushing. "This is enough," Boone snapped. His voice hardened, losing its veneer of civility. "Sheriff, do your duty. Or do I need to have my men enforce the law?" The sheriff reached for his cuffs. "Stand down. Sheriff." The voice came from Jonah. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. He landed heavily, staggering slightly, but he straightened up. He walked to stand beside Clara. He looked beaten, bloody, and old, but he held himself with a dignity that silenced the street. Boone sneered. "The drifter speaks, and why should anyone listen to a hired killer? Because I am one," Jonah said. The admission hung in the air. Jonah looked at the crowd. He looked at the reverend, the mayor, the women who had scorned him. "He is right," Jonah said, his voice rough gravel. "I am a killer. I rode with the Red River outfit. I have burned homesteads. I have cleared valleys just like this one for men just like him." He pointed a bloody hand at Boone. "I know the smell of coal oil on a barn wall," Jonah continued. "I know what lie does to a horse's gut, and I know the look in a man's eye when he decides that profit matters more than blood." Murmurs of killer and murderer rippled through the crowd. A woman near the front hissed, "And she lays with him. Look at her, a whore for a gunman." Clara flinched as if slapped. The word cut deeper than the cold. She saw the disgust in their eyes, the judgment of a town that valued propriety over truth. Jonah did not flinch. He stepped in front of Clara, shielding her from their gaze. "Yes, I have sinned," Jonah roared. "I have blood on these hands that will never wash off. My wife, my Ellen, she died because I could not put the gun down. I carry that every day. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am not asking for your mercy." He paused, looking at the stable boy from Boone's ranch who had snuck into the edge of the crowd. "But I am telling you this," Jonah said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that carried on the wind. "I did those things for men like Silas Boone. I was the weapon he holds in his hand, and when he is done with you, when he has taken your land and your dignity, he will discard you just like he tried to discard me." He turned to Boone. "You are not a builder. Silas, you are a grave robber." Boone's face turned a mottled purple. He drew his revolver. "Kill them!" He ordered his men. "Kill them both!" The gunman hesitated. It was one thing to shoot a drifter in a canyon. It was another to gun down a man and a woman in front of a church in broad daylight. "Draw!" Boone screamed. "Wait!" The cry came from the edge of the crowd. It was the stable boy. "Timmy!" He ran forward, his face bruised and swollen. "He is telling the truth!" Timmy shouted, tears streaming down his face. "Mister, Boone beat me. He beat me because I saw them bring the kerosene back the night of the fire." "Shut up, boy!" Walter Prine yelled. "No!" Another voice joined in. It was the father of the starving family, the squatter Clara had helped. He stepped off the boardwalk, holding a rusty shotgun. "That woman gave my children food when you spat on us. If she says he is a crook, he is a crook." Suddenly, the dam broke. "That is my land he fenced off." A farmer shouted. "He threatened my wife." Another cried. The crowd shifted. The fear that had held them paralyzed was replaced by a sudden, volatile anger. They outnumbered the gunmen 10-1. Boone saw the tide turning. He saw his empire crumbling in the eyes of the people he thought he owned. Panic, cold and sharp, replaced his arrogance. "Kill them!" Boone shrieked, raising his gun and firing wildly at Jonah. The shot went wide, shattering a church window. Chaos erupted. Jonah shoved Clara down behind the water trough. "Stay down." He drew his revolver. The movement was pure muscle memory, faster than his age should have allowed. Boone's men opened fire. The street filled with the deafening roar of black powder. Bullets chewed up the dirt, splintered the wood of the boardwalks, and sent townsfolk scrambling for cover. But they did not just run. The young sheriff's deputy, a boy named Caleb who had always walked in the sheriff's shadow, pulled his rifle. "No!" he shouted. He fired at Ed Cobb, hitting the gunman in the shoulder. The blacksmith, a giant of a man, threw his hammer, striking another gunman in the chest and knocking him from his horse. Jonah rose from behind the trough. He was not fighting for money. He was not fighting for land. He was fighting for the woman huddled in the dirt behind him. He saw a gunman taking aim at the squatter family. Jonah fired. The man fell. He saw Walter Prine trying to spur his horse through the crowd, trampling people. Jonah fired again, putting a bullet through Walter's hat, sending the banker's nephew tumbling into the dust. But Boone was still on his horse, screaming in rage, firing down at the crowd. He turned his gun toward Clara, who had risen to her knees to pull the stable boy to safety. "No!" Jonah roared. He broke cover. He stepped directly into the line of fire. Boone fired. Jonah jerked as the bullet took him in the thigh, his bad leg buckling. He went down to one knee. Boone cocked the hammer for the kill shot, a sneer twisting his face. But he never pulled the trigger. A shot rang out, not from Jonah, and not from the deputy. Clara stood by the trough. She held the heavy Henry rifle she had carried from the ranch. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were open. Smoke curled from the barrel. Silas Boone looked down at his chest. A red blossom was spreading across his white shirt. He looked at Clara with an expression of utter shock. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. He slumped forward, sliding slowly out of the saddle. He hit the frozen dirt with a heavy, final thud. He lay sprawled in the street he had thought he owned, dead in the dust that belonged to other people. The shooting stopped. The silence that followed was ringing and absolute. The gun smoke drifted in the cold air, a gray fog that slowly revealed the carnage. 2 of Boone's men were down. The others had thrown up their hands, surrounded by angry townsfolk holding pitchforks and old muskets. Jonah slumped against the trough, clutching his leg. Blood was pooling beneath him. Clara dropped the rifle. She ran to him, falling to her knees in the mud. "Jonah!" She pressed her hands over the wound, trying to staunch the flow. Her dress was ruined, soaked in his blood and the mud of the street. "I'm all right," Jonah rasped, though his face was the color of old ash. Just another hole." The town gathered around them. The circle was tight. They looked at Boone's body, then at Walter Prine, who was being hauled to his feet by the sheriff in handcuffs. Then they looked at Jonah. There was no cheering. There was no hero's welcome. The violence had been too ugly. The truths exposed too raw. He killed men. "Mrs.," Gable whispered, clutching her shawl. "He brought this here. He saved us," the stable boy said, standing defiantly next to Clara. The sheriff looked down at Jonah. He looked at the gun in Jonah's hand. "We have got a problem," the sheriff said heavily. "Boone is dead." "But this man, he is a confessed killer, and he just shot 2 men in my street. He defended us," Clara cried, looking up at them like a cornered wolf. "You all stood there and did nothing. He is the only one who fought. We cannot just let him walk," the mayor said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "There are laws. Clara, we are a civilized town." "Civilized?" Clara laughed. A hysterical, broken sound. "You watched them burn my home. You watched them starve my neighbors. And now you want to talk about laws." The crowd murmured. "Divided." They were grateful. Yes, but they were also afraid. Jonah was a reminder of the violence they wanted to forget. He was a mirror showing them their own cowardice. "Take him to the saloon," the sheriff decided. "We will figure this out of the cold." They carried Jonah into the Golden Nugget. They laid him on a billiard table. The green felt instantly staining dark. The doctor was called. He worked silently, cutting away the trouser leg, digging for the bullet. Jonah gritted his teeth, refusing the whiskey they offered. He watched the faces around the room, the jury of his peers. The debate raged for an hour. Some wanted to hang him, to wash the town clean of all the violence, Boone's and Jonah's alike. Some wanted to pin a badge on him. Clara stood by his head, wiping the sweat from his brow. She listened to them weigh his life against their comfort. Finally, she slammed her hand on the table. "Enough!" she shouted. The room went quiet. "You want to judge him?" Clara looked at the reverend. "You preach about redemption. You preach about the lost sheep. Well, here is a man who walked into the fire for you. Here is a man who admitted his sins while you hid yours." She looked at the women who had called her a whore. "You call me names because I chose him, because he is old, because he is scarred, but he is more of a man than any of you will ever know. He did not hide. He did not lie. He stood up. And if that is a crime in this town, then you better hang me too, because I am with him. Today, tomorrow, and until the day I die." She leaned down and kissed Jonah's forehead. In front of the mayor, the sheriff, and God himself. The silence stretched. The sheriff rubbed his jaw. He looked at the townsfolk. He saw the shame in their eyes, and the grudging respect. "We cannot hang him," the sheriff said finally. "It would not be right. But he cannot be a hero," the mayor added quickly. "It sends the wrong message." "A compromise," the banker suggested. The sheriff turned to Jonah. "You can stay, Carver. You can live here. We will not charge you for the shooting today. It was self-defense. But do not expect us to forget who you are. Do not expect a parade. You walk a straight line in this town. One step off, and we will remember the Red River." Jonah looked up at the sheriff. He saw the fear that would always be there. He saw that he would always be the wolf they let sleep by the fire, never the dog they petted. "I can live with that," Jonah whispered. The crowd dispersed slowly, leaving them alone in the dim light of the saloon. The air smelled of stale beer and blood. Walter Prine was taken to the jail cell. The doctor finished binding Jonah's leg. "You are going to have a limp," the doctor said, packing his bag. "A bad one. And you are lucky to be alive." Jonah sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the table. He felt light, hollowed out, but alive. He looked at Clara. She was covered in dirt, her hair wild, her dress ruined. She had lost her standing in the town. She would never be the respectable Miss Hayes again. She was the woman who lived with the gunman. "I am sorry," Jonah said. "I cost you everything." Clara stepped between his knees. She placed her hands on his shoulders. "You cost me a lie," she said softly, "and you gave me the truth." She leaned her forehead against his. "Let them talk. Jonah, let them stare. We have work to do." Months passed. The seasons turned, the brutal winter giving way to a wet, muddy spring, and then the baking heat of summer returned. But the drought had broken. The creek ran again. A thin silver ribbon of life. The livery was rebuilt. It was smaller this time, just a simple barn and a solid corral. The sign out front read, "Carver Hayes Livery." It was not an easy life. The town kept its distance. Women crossed the street to avoid walking too close to Clara. Men nodded to Jonah but did not stop to chat. They were the outsiders, the necessary monsters who lived at the edge of the village. But slowly, things changed. The water line was fixed. Jonah dug a new well, deeper than the old one, and he built an irrigation ditch that he shared with the Miller widow next door. The stable boy, Timmy, came to work for them, preferring the gruff silence of the livery to the pity of the town. One evening, late in August, the work was finally done. The sun had set, leaving a sky painted in violent streaks of orange and violet. The air was cooling, the heat of the day radiating up from the earth. Jonah sat on the porch of the small cabin they had built behind the livery. He was cleaning a bridle, his hands moving with the slow, deliberate rhythm of habit. He walked with a cane now, his legs stiff and aching when the weather turned, but his back was straight. Clara came out of the house, drying her hands on an apron. She looked tired. There were new lines around her eyes, etched by the sun and the worry of the last year. But she looked strong. She walked up behind him and placed her hands on his shoulders. She dug her thumbs into the tight muscles of his neck. "You are stiff," she said. Jonah leaned back into her touch, closing his eyes. "Hauled too much hay today." "You are stubborn," Clara teased gently. "You try to do the work of two men." "I have to keep up with you," Jonah rumbled. Clara massaged the ache, her fingers strong and sure. "You are getting slow. Old man, I beat you to the water pump this morning." Jonah opened his eyes. He looked out at the corral, where the gray mare and a new foal were grazing in the twilight. He looked at the land that was theirs, not by deed alone, but by blood and sweat. He reached up and covered Clara's hand with his own. He pulled her around until she was standing in front of him. "Slow," he repeated, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Too old." Clara smiled, the old joke warm between them. "Too old for this work. Too old for me." Jonah pulled her down onto his lap. She went willingly, curling against him. He tossed the bridle aside and wrapped his arms around her. His hands, scarred, battered, missing a fingernail on the left index finger, rested on her waist. He looked at her. He saw the woman who had stood in front of a mob for him. He saw the woman who had chosen the hard road because it was the only one that went somewhere real. "Too old?" he whispered, his voice low and rough, sending a shiver down her spine. He brought his hand up to cup her neck, his thumb brushing her pulse. "Then watch what these hands can do." Clara did not answer with words. She looked at him. Her eyes held the reflection of the stars that were just beginning to pierce the darkening sky. In her gaze was the memory of the fire, the cold of the mountain cabin, the fear of the gunfight, and the quiet, enduring peace of the life they had built from the ashes. She leaned in and kissed him. Outside, the wind howled off the plains, cold and lonely, hunting for ghosts. But inside the circle of their arms, the warmth burned steady and bright, a fire that no storm could ever put out. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Jonah and Clara through the dust and fire of the American West. It is a story about resilience, the cost of justice, and the kind of love that survives when everything else burns away. I would love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Please leave a comment and let me know which part of the world you are in. What did you think? Did you like the ending? Did Jonah and Clara make the right choice? Share your thoughts in English in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Thank you, and until next time, keep your powder dry.